The air over Kyushu on July 2, 1945, was a canvas of impossible blue. Captain Joe Lynch, leading his Marine squadron, held the high ground at 21,000 feet. It was an altitude advantage he had not felt since the desperate early days of Guadalcanal. Below them, the target was a tremendous wave of 80 Japanese fighters, gleaming like polished silver. These were not the brittle Zeks of old, but the rare, heavily armed Kawanishi George, among the finest interceptors Japan had ever built. Their pilots were known to be tough customers. "Tally-ho!" Lynch roared into his mask. 8 Corsairs plunged earthward, the auxiliary belly tanks dropping away, tumbling silently into the abyss. The Marine fighters were now lightened for the kill. Tracers streamed across the sky, arcing up and down in a chaotic, high-speed ballet as the dogfight raged with spectacular intensity. Then, in a single paralyzing heartbeat, the world on Lynch's right wing exploded. A shell slammed into the armor plate directly behind his back, delivering a deafening crack that vibrated through his spine. Instantly, the ammunition stored in the wing caught fire, the flames feeding on the high-altitude oxygen. Lynch began choking, not on smoke, but on the acrid, chemical stench of burning cordite seeping through the rubber of his oxygen mask. The Corsair, crippled and burning, snapped into a 45-degree dive. He fought the controls, his right wing a ruin of twisted metal glowing red-hot against the darkening sky. He locked his left knee against the control stick and shoved full right rudder, fighting the tremendous torque that threatened to roll him over and send him spinning into the sea 20,000 feet below. The fire, surprisingly, blew out in the dive, smothered by the sheer velocity. He leveled at about 1,500 feet, the ocean rushing up to meet him. His right wing was annihilated, bearing a hole so large that a 6-foot man could have dropped through it, revealing the water below. The Japanese pilots, aggressive and employing excellent tactics, had written him off as a lost casualty in the flames and never pursued. For over 300 miles, Lynch nursed the shattered Corsair home. His right leg trembled uncontrollably from the sheer physical strain of holding the full rudder input, a desperate testament to the F4U's ruggedness and the pilot's will to survive. But to understand the courage required in the final days of the war, we must look back at how American air power began. Decades before that frantic duel over Kyushu, the foundation of American air power was laid, not necessarily in aggressive design, but in perceived threats and political maneuvering. The 1930s saw the expansion of aviation programs, fostering pilot training and the production of early fighters like the P-26. Pilot Frank Holmes, dreaming of flight over San Francisco, recalled those early planes with their white scarves streaming in the wind. By late 1941, the US had a nascent air force built on congressional support. Yet it was dangerously unprepared for the scale and sophistication of the coming storm. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological ambush that galvanized a nation. Second Lieutenant Frank Holmes, stationed at the Halawe gunnery camp, awoke that Sunday morning with a horrible headache. It was the residue of a celebratory night at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, the intoxicating freedom following a week of restriction. Now, the suspicion that the recent practice alert was real was confirmed by a sound that ripped through the morning calm. It was a whirring, whooshing noise followed by the unmistakable crash of ordnance. The radio announcer's voice offered a surreal, startlingly calm counterpoint to the violence. "Don't get excited, the voice said. "The Japs have attacked Pearl Harbor, but the army has the situation well in hand." For Holmes, the realization was chilling. He thought, if the rest of the army feels like me, we're in trouble. The desperate scramble began immediately. Holmes and his friend Johnny Voss commandeered a civilian Studebaker Champion racing toward Wheeler Field. The devastation they passed was total. They saw one hangar that looked like it had been melted and crushed in. At Wheeler, the sight was a gut punch. 75 P-40 fighters, the nation's primary defense, were lined up and burning on the parking ramp. The enemy had achieved devastating success, destroying aircraft including the improved P-36s with their peculiar shotgun shell starters before they could even get airborne. In the chaos, a sergeant managed to find Holmes an aircraft to fly. It was a biplane with 2 open cockpits. This was the primitive state of American air resources, thrust suddenly into modern warfare. The humiliation was immediate and widespread across the Pacific. Surprise attacks, particularly in the Philippines, caught American forces completely flat-footed, their aircraft destroyed on the ground. Pilots, many with insufficient training, were thrown into action flying machines that were utterly outclassed. Lieutenant Jim Moorhead, flying the P-40 in Java, described the situation as pitiful. It was a series of futile, sacrificial calls to duty. The P-40B, while offering armor and self-sealing tanks, was a dog against the nimble Zero, capable of escaping only in a dive. As the Japanese steamroller advanced, surviving air groups were ordered into a desperate, chaotic withdrawal to Java in early February 1942. Pilots felt they were not fighting for victory, but merely existing as replacements. They were temporary fodder for the maw of the great killing machine, total modern warfare. The early Pacific War was a brutal lesson in humility and sacrifice. It demonstrated the steep, unforgiving price of strategic unpreparedness, setting the stage for the immense learning curve that lay ahead. The desperate, humiliating retreat from the Philippines and Java had bled the United States Air Forces white. The Japanese advance, however, could not be stopped with retreat alone. The only answer was a strategic, high-stakes gamble. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 became the decisive turning point. Here, the war shifted violently from land-based humiliation to carrier-based supremacy. Aboard the USS Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Scott McCuskey prepared his F4F Wildcat. He knew the limitations of his machine intimately. The F4F4 model was rugged, capable of outrunning any Zero in a dive, but it was heavy. Its 650 caliber guns offered more firepower but less firing duration than the earlier model, meaning McCuskey had to conserve every burst. The air over the fleet was a maelstrom of Japanese Val dive bombers and Zeros. McCuskey plunged into the first wave of 18 Vals, his hands slick with sweat inside his gloves. He flew directly into the enemy formation, his aim true. The Wildcat shuddered from the recoil of its guns as he fired at point-blank range, watching the Japanese bombers shudder, smoke, and break apart. The chaos of the battle was absolute. The Japanese fighter screen had been drawn low by the suicidal, unsupported attacks of the American TBD Devastator torpedo planes. This sacrifice cost over 90% of their crews, but it left the skies open for the American dive bombers and fighters. McCuskey saw the strategic opportunity and pressed the attack, maneuvering his heavy fighter between the Val formations. He claimed 3 victories in a blur of motion. Then his guns fell silent. They were empty. He closed on a circling Val, recalling the grim, desperate advice passed down from the early days. If out of ammunition, you were told to cut off their tails with your propeller. He prepared to ram, but the moment passed, and he let the enemy go. His individual courage bought precious time, preventing as many as 11 Vals from reaching their targets. But the cost to the fleet was staggering. Midway proved definitively that carrier air power, not battleships, would rule the Pacific. The Japanese carrier fleet, the engine of their expansion, was crippled beyond repair. The victory at Midway bought the Allies a precarious foothold, but the next phase of the war was pure, grinding attrition. This was the brutal battle for Guadalcanal. The American air arm was forced into daily, desperate air battles against a still superior enemy. They operated from the most primitive conditions imaginable. The strategic objective was Henderson Field, named for a Marine dive bomber pilot killed during the Midway action. For 3 weeks after the Marines landed, Japanese aircraft attacked the beachhead with impunity. The Marines pushed forward, engineers carving a runway directly into the jungle. Finally, in August of 1942, the first warplanes landed, Marine Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers. These were augmented by the Army Air Corps' P-400 Airacobras, which, lacking oxygen, could not even reach the altitude of the high-flying Japanese Betty bombers. This was the Cactus Air Force, named for Guadalcanal's call sign, and its mission was simple. Ensign John Wesolowski, a Navy pilot rejected by the Army Air Corps for a deviated septum, arrived aboard the Saratoga. He was launched to Henderson Field on 9/11/1942. The reality was one of constant, exhausting duty. Pilots were on alert 24 hours a day, sleeping on benches or picnic tables, running or being driven by jeep to randomly parked planes. The air was thick with the smell of jungle rot and aviation fuel. The dirt runway, designated Fighter 1, offered absolutely no maintenance facilities. Scrambles were daily, frantic sprints into the sky, often before formations could even be properly assembled. The tactics were simple: climb to 30,000 feet, attempt an overhead or high-side run on the bombers, and then survive the ensuing melee. Wesolowski, flying an F4F4 patched together with scavenged parts, found himself alone and lost in the clouds one afternoon. Aircraft performance varied wildly, sometimes due to something as simple as spark plug age. The isolation was profound. Suddenly, he swore he heard machine gun fire and saw two Zeeks diving on him. The 7.7mm tracers impacted his plane. He spotted a third Zeke that had overshot. On instinct, he fired a snapshot, his 6 guns spitting their deadly mix of tracer and armor-piercing rounds. The enemy fighter just seemed to break apart. He nosed over vertically, attempting a desperate half-slow roll to evade the remaining 2 Zeks, struggling to pull out due to the extreme speed. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots were dangerous and scared, their confidence shattered, forced into a natural selection process where only the most aggressive, adaptable, and lucky survived. Wesolowski's own skipper, Lieutenant Commander Leroy Simpler, frustrated by the unreliable aircraft performance, once cried out in exasperation, "Take Wesolowski off my wing. I don't want him there anymore."
The issue was not the pilot, but the constant mechanical failure inherent in fighting from a mud strip at the end of the line.
Yet this primitive Cactus Air Force, through sheer grit and immense sacrifice, achieved the impossible. By mid-November, the Japanese Imperial Navy had lost approximately 600 first-line combat aircraft and nearly as many crack pilots over Guadalcanal. The island was secured, a testament to the brutal grinding war of attrition that finally began to turn the strategic balance in the Pacific. The grinding, desperate struggle for Guadalcanal had proven that America could not win through sheer willpower alone. The early, outmoded fighters had been bled dry, their pilots decimated by malaria, dengue fever, and the superior performance of the Zero. The solution arrived in 2 long-legged, heavily armored Predators: the Lockheed P-38 Lightning for the Army Air Forces and the Grumman F6F Hellcat for the Navy. When the P-38 Lightning arrived in the New Guinea theater, morale soared. Here was a machine that could climb above 12,000 feet without gasping, armed with 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. This technological leap enabled Admiral Ernest King's new bypass strategy. This offensive approach was designed to avoid costly frontal assaults on every fortified island. Instead of capturing Japanese strongholds, the Allies would seize forward positions like Finschhafen, Cape Gloucester, and Arroway, leaving the enemy garrisons to rot on the vine. But for the strategy to work, the Japanese air arm had to be neutralized entirely. This required a relentless, calculated campaign of attrition against the greatest Japanese stronghold in the South Pacific, Rabaul. The objective was not to conquer the base, but to bleed it. Bluntly, the bombers were sent daily against Rabaul for the sole purpose of drawing up the Japanese fighters. This was an 18-month campaign of intentional, high-stakes combat designed to destroy Japan's irreplaceable pool of experienced pilots. The strategy culminated in the massive, coordinated strikes of November of 1943. On November 2nd, known as Bloody Tuesday, USAAF pilot Marion Kirby, flying a P-38G, prepared for the Rabaul run. The anxiety was a physical weight. Kirby later recalled that there was not but a handful of men, both bomber and fighter, that got a decent night's sleep for the 3 nights prior to the mission. They all knew it was going to be rough. The approach was terrifying. The B-25 bombers flew low, just 200 to 300 feet above the water, using the surface to mask their approach. The P-38 escorts flew just above them, placing the fighters pretty damned close to the muzzles of the enemy guns. Kirby's own takeoff was shaky, his nervousness causing him to damage an instrument. He was constantly tracking his fuel, a pervasive anxiety in the Southwest Pacific. As long as you were contending with weather, jungles, water, and the enemy, you were constantly concerned about fuel. The P-38's internal tanks, even with 2 165-gallon belly tanks, could be exhausted in 15 minutes of intense combat. The sky over Rabaul erupted into a maelstrom of flak and interceptors. Major George Chandler, flying high cover in a P-38H, leveraged the lightning's speed. He employed a 6 o'clock high diving tactic to break up Japanese formations rather than engage in turning dogfights. One chaotic moment, Chandler dove on 2 enemy bombers, shooting them down into the water. As he roared back up, he saw the ultimate reward of his action, a Marine on deck, saved by the immediate intervention. The Marine later sought Chandler out just to thank him. The cold at 25,000 feet was severe, a brutal contrast to the oppressive heat of the jungle airfields. But the constant, brutal air offensive was working. Between December of 1943 and February of 1944 alone, Allied pilots claimed 789 confirmed victories around Rabaul, shattering the core of the Imperial Navy's air arm. Meanwhile, the US Navy introduced its own technological answer to the Zero, the F6F Hellcat. This new breed of fighter was built for speed, durability, and a devastating punch. The butterflies of earlier carrier operations were gone, replaced by a readiness that made pilots feel they could finally take on the Japanese this time. This confidence was violently justified on November 23, 1943, over the Gilberts. Lieutenant Junior Grade Ralph Hanks, meticulous about his plane, number 37, was launched as part of a strike against Japanese airfields. The engagement was a blur of speed and violence. Hanks found himself in the midst of a Japanese formation, his .650 caliber machine guns roaring. He engaged a flurry of enemy fighters, banking and diving, the Hellcat a stable, forgiving platform under immense G-forces. In a mere 5 minutes, Hanks tore through the enemy formation, his bursts finding their mark again and again. 5 Japanese fighters were destroyed. Ralph Hanks had achieved the impossible, the Navy's first Hellcat ace in a day. Upon returning to the carrier, he orbited, waiting for fuel and ammunition, his wingman nowhere in sight.
This was a grim reminder that speed was sometimes the only wingman a pilot had.
Back on deck, he was instantly christened 5-Shot Hanks. He was immediately thrust into the Hollywood way of war, interviewed over the ship's public address system. The sudden fame was jarring. Hanks confessed that at that moment he would rather have been home in Red Bluff showing hogs. But the personal triumph was secondary to the strategic victory. The F6F Hellcat, fast and capable, had delivered the decisive technological edge. Combined with the long reach of the P-38, this air superiority paved the way for the invasion of Cape Torokina on November 1, 1943. King's bypass strategy worked. The enemy fortress was bypassed, crucial airfields were secured, and the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul was left to rot, surrounded by overwhelming Allied air power. The era of Allied technological dominance and calculated attrition had begun, transforming the war from a desperate defense into a systematic, brutal offensive. The transition from calculated attrition to overwhelming dominance was commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Pete Mitcher. Mitcher was an aggressive leader who replaced the more conservative Vice Admiral Charles Pownall at the head of Task Force 58. Mitcher's doctrine was simple: relentless, coordinated strikes delivered by a growing fleet of carriers and the robust new Hellcat fighters. The strategic objective was no longer to merely hold ground, but to neutralize the great Japanese strongholds entirely, allowing the Allies to bypass them. Buck was the first target of this new, overwhelming carrier doctrine. Known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific, the vast lagoon held immense strategic value and a massive concentration of Japanese naval and air power. On the pre-dawn of February 17, 1944, the colossal air attack began. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Hobbs May, flying an F6F Hellcat from the light carrier Langley, strapped into his cockpit in a driving rainstorm. The air was heavy, humid, and charged with static electricity. Inside the cockpit, the instruments were hooded, glowing faintly in red light, providing the only illumination against the black, stormy sky. May's engine roared, deep and smooth, the huge propeller tearing violently at the night air. The plane threatened to rip itself from the deck as he held the brakes. His mouth was dry, the certain sign of apprehension. When the cable released, the tremendous slamming pressure of the catapult hurled him forward into the tempestuous dawn. He joined over 100 fighters climbing into the broken overcast. Intelligence had suggested more than 100 large ships and numerous aircraft were waiting, but as May's squadron arrived, they were met by 44 Japanese fighters rising to intercept them. May thought to himself, "How in hell are we going to fight our way through such overwhelming odds?" He twisted his neck desperately to check his 6. The sky immediately became a violent, deadly dogfight, a high-speed maelstrom that one pilot later described as Pearl Harbor in reverse. Flaming red tracers slashed through the air. Pieces of burning debris from destroyed aircraft tumbled through the sky, forcing May to constantly jink and evade, fearing a wing strike or propeller damage. His neck ached from the constant, desperate twisting as he pulled the Hellcat through hard, high G turns. The physical strain caused sweat to run into his eyes and soak his flight suit. Below, the heavily defended ridges poured up curtains of exploding 20mm and 37mm shells, blooming in black clouds around the formation. Amidst the frantic radio calls, explosions and determination, May fought through the Japanese screen. By the time the strike was over, ships were exploding, burning, and sinking inside the lagoon. Truk was neutralized, its facilities wiped out, and Japan's capacity to project naval power from the Central Pacific was irrevocably crippled. The strategic imperative then shifted to the Marianas. Operation Forager aimed to seize Saipan and Tinian, placing American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese High Command, desperate, planned a decisive Grand Fleet action to defend the islands, committing nearly all their remaining carrier air power. This set the stage for the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. The US Navy had the technological and, more critically, the human advantage. The Hellcat's armor, speed, and self-sealing tanks were superior to the newer, but still fragile Japanese aircraft. Furthermore, Japan's pilot training had become execrable, their air groups filled with green, inexperienced flyers. The contrast with the skilled, aggressive American carrier pilots was devastating. The day began with a tense scramble. The ready room climate aboard the carriers was like a locker room before a big football game, full of butterflies and little conversation. Then came the alert. Hey, Rube. Hundreds of inbound Japanese planes were detected. Lieutenant Junior Grade Tex Vineyard, the division leader for Ginger 12, was circling near Orote Field, tasked with protecting a downed comrade. The wind cut like glass against his canopy as he circled at a precarious 100 feet. He was isolated, staring down at the vulnerable pilot below, when the air shattered. A frantic voice broke through the radio static, sharp and urgent. The voice cried, "Any American fighter, I have 40 Jap planes surrounded at Orote Airfield. I need some help."
Vineyard looked up. The sky was suddenly filled with enemy aircraft, wave after wave of vowels and zeros, their distinctive red meatballs stark against the blue.
He realized he was directly in the path of the approaching group.
Boy, this is it, he thought, the adrenaline surging.
His goal was to make it good and get as many as he could before they knew he was there. He pushed the Hellcat into a climb, engaging the lead formation. His .650 caliber machine guns roared, spitting tracers that converged on the enemy. The recoil slammed through the airframe. He watched a valve explode instantly, followed by the top of another's vertical stabilizer disintegrating. He saw the grim, clinical horror of combat up close. Several bullets hit the rear seat gunner in the chest before the plane disintegrated. The noise of impact on his own plane sounded like someone throws a handful of large rocks against a galvanized tin roof. Oil smeared his cowling and windshield, a sickening visual reminder of the damage. Vineyard fought through the wave, the sky a mad flying circus. He twice had to disengage as his guns faltered, only to push back in, determined not to leave the downed pilot exposed. His canopy was shot up, holes riddled his wings, and his radio was dead. But the Japanese formations were shattering, their inexperience evident in their panicked maneuvers. By the end of the day, June 19, 1944, the Marianas Turkey Shoot was complete. 380 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in the air. The core of Japan's carrier air capability was annihilated, a loss that could never be replaced. The final great act of the naval war was the Philippines campaign, triggered by MacArthur's invasion. The monumental clash at Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 effectively marked the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive force. The vast carrier forces of Mitchell and Halsey ranged across the central Philippines, finding no worthy opposition. The remaining resistance was met by the small, hardy escort carriers, the so-called Jeep carriers, and their FM-2 fighters. These aircraft, operating close to the beachheads, became instrumental in providing close air support and anti-shipping missions. They acted as a vast sinkhole for Japan's remaining war material. At Leyte, Lieutenant Ken Hippie, flying from the small escort carrier Kalinin Bay, became an instant ace on October 24. He shot down 4 Lily bombers in a single frenzied engagement against a massive Japanese airstrike. Hippie had waited months for this moment, and in the chaos, he admitted he was so excited that I forgot to drop my wing tanks. His focus was singular, driven by a raw fury. He later expressed, "I have been very sorry ever since that I didn't ram the bastard and bail out."
This desperate defense of the Philippines proved that American air superiority was now absolutely
Forged through technological power and relentless bravery, the skies of the Pacific were irrevocably won. The invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa represented the final, most brutal grind of the Pacific War. The strategic goal was clear: capture airfields close enough to launch the final attack on the Japanese home islands. This goal was achieved, but at an immense human cost, demanding extraordinary courage against a desperate and fanatical enemy. The logistical scale of the Okinawa invasion, commencing April 1, 1945, was staggering. Thousands of Navy transports and warships converged, yet the scale of the Japanese response was terrifyingly personal. It was here the widespread deployment of the kamikaze tactic fundamentally changed the nature of air defense. Every combat air patrol mission instantly became a high-stakes gamble. For Marine Second Lieutenant Dewey Durnford, the duty was hours of boredom relieved by seconds of sheer terror. The traditional dogfight was over. The sky was now a delivery system for living bombs. Durnford witnessed the introduction of the terrifying Baka bomb, a manned rocket-propelled glider. He watched it carried beneath a Helen bomber, describing it chillingly as a papoose. On April 28, he shot down 2 nates on kamikaze runs, confronting the raw, suicidal determination of the enemy pilot. Yet the technological edge the Allies had established was still prone to failure under extreme conditions. Lieutenant Joe Robbins, flying the F4U-1C Corsair, discovered a critical systemic flaw. The new 20mm cannons, intended to provide more destructive power than the reliable 50-caliber machine guns, malfunctioned in the brutal cold above 15,000 feet. Robbins would line up a target, his sights locked, only to pull the trigger and hear nothing. "No guns," he lamented, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. This failure was discovered too late, only after high-altitude test flights had been cancelled, leaving pilots like his wingman Ensign Frank Siddall vulnerable and shot down. But survival became its own form of mastery. Lieutenant Junior Grade Harry Swinburne had barely survived a night landing of a damaged Hellcat earlier in the campaign. Now, he was an ace, his F6F tearing through the skies over Okinawa. On April 6th, he downed 2 Zeikis off Ie Shima. 10 days later, another Zeik and a Kate fell to his guns. The physical and psychological toll remained immense, even for the survivors. One unnamed lieutenant flew a critically damaged Hellcat back toward the fleet. A section of his left wing was missing, and he had no left landing gear. Lost and low on fuel, he mistook a destroyer for his carrier, the Hornet. His Aldis lamp blinked a desperate message into the darkness. The landing signal officer finally saw the plane and began guiding it in, unaware of the extent of the damage. The pilot knew he couldn't risk a wave-off. Torquing the engine with a partial wing and no flaps meant the plane would immediately crash. He landed, the Hellcat shuddering violently as the emergency air bottle deployed the remaining gear. The impact jarred his teeth. The LSO rushed up to the cockpit, crying out in shock, "Why didn't anyone tell me you were damaged?" The constant air patrols and relentless combat continued into the high summer of 1945. Now we return to the desperate spiral of Captain Joe Lynch over Kyushu on July 2, 1945. Lynch had fought the crippled Corsair down to 1,500 feet, the flames on his right wing extinguished by the sheer velocity of the dive. He was alive, but the world was still spinning. The shell that struck his armor plate had not killed him, but the resulting fire had consumed the wing structure. The twisted metal where the ammunition was stored began to glow a dull, dangerous red. He was 300 miles from Okinawa, and his plane was riddled with holes. One gaping wound in the wing revealed the ocean rushing below. His right leg was locked against the rudder, shoved to the firewall to counter the immense torque and asymmetric lift loss. This sustained, agonizing effort caused his leg to tremble violently, a tremor that would not stop for hours. The Japanese pilots, among the best Lynch had ever encountered, had seen the fiery dive and ridden him off for dead. He was alone, nursing the wounded machine back toward the distant haven. The trip was slow, uncomfortable, and fraught with the silent fear that the remaining fuel in his belly tank was a time bomb waiting to explode. Every mile he flew was a testament to the Corsair's ruggedness and his own sheer will. He eventually sighted the airfield on Okinawa. He brought the wounded plane down, the landing a chaotic event but survivable. He happily bailed out of the cockpit, collapsing onto the metal PSP strip. He survived, cementing his ace status, having faced the finest fighters Japan could offer at the very end of the war. The war ended shortly thereafter, the overwhelming dominance of American air power finally complete. This dominance was secured through industrial capacity, technological superiority, and the collective courage of pilots like Lynch. The ultimate legacy of the Pacific Aces was not just the number of victories, but the sheer survival and adaptability that defined their journey from the primitive biplane to the rugged F6F Hellcat and the F4U Corsair. Pilots like Major Charlie King, who had fought his way through the grueling green nightmare of New Guinea, were already transitioning to the next era. They were flying the experimental P-80 jet fighter. The age of the high-performance piston-engined fighter was over, replaced by the roar of the jet engine, carrying the hard-won experience of America's Eagles into the cold, strategic conflicts that lay ahead. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video.
It helps us preserve these stories, and please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.